All right, so today let's dive into something that, on the surface sounds pretty straightforward. We're talking about simplicity. We're going deep with some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia, Philosophy's Entry on Simplicity.
It's a great one.
Yeah, so ready to kind of untangle how philosophers, wrestle with this idea.
Yeah, it's one of those concepts that, we use all the time, but then trying to pin it down and define it rigorously and figure out, like, why it's valuable gets really tricky really fast.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So for our listener, who's philosophically inclined, we're going to unpack how thinkers have grappled with different types of simplicity, whether favoring it is justified and even some arguments against it.
Yeah, and the source, jumps right in, kind of into two main flavors of simplicity, right? You have elegance and you have parsimony. And so elegance is like that, that perfectly streamlined theory. Think, a beautiful equation. It's all about how things are put together, the syntax.
Okay, so elegance is about the presentation, making it look simple.
Yeah.
But then there's parsimony, which is more about, like, what's actually there, right?
Precisely, yeah. Parsimony is ontological. It wants fewer fundamental entities, kind of like a minimalist's dream universe, right?
Yeah.
Less stuff, less clutter, at least in terms of the basic building blocks.
But here's where my brain starts to get all knotted up. The source points out that these two can clash. Sometimes making a theory look elegant, like with that simple syntax, actually means adding more entities behind the scenes.
Right. Yeah, it's a trade-off, right? The example that they give is the discovery of Neptune. Astronomers were having a really hard time with these planetary orbits. They just weren't, they weren't working out. And so to make the math simpler, they hypothesized another planet, and bam, there was Neptune, right? So it was a very elegant solution, but it added a whole new celestial body to our model.
Right. Yeah. So sometimes, like, what appears simple on the surface is actually hiding, maybe a lot of complexity underneath.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about, all those seemingly simple explanations that we encounter.
Yeah, it does. It does raise the question of, like, what are we really aiming for with simplicity, right?
Right.
And that leads us to, the infamous Occam's razor, right? That philosophical guideline to not multiply entities beyond necessity.
Right. Yeah. It sounds straightforward, but the source is quick to point out the issues, right?
Right.
Like, what counts is truly necessary.
Mhm.
And when are competing theories really equal in all other respects?
Exactly. It's very rarely a clear-cut situation. Theories almost never line up perfectly. So trying to, like, apply Occam's razor becomes more art than science, it seems like.
Okay, so if it's not always, so simple to apply, how have philosophers tried to justify this preference for simplicity? Is there something inherently special about it, or is it more of an aesthetic judgment,
Well, historically, you see this fascinating interplay of, theological, metaphysical, and empirical justifications, right? So early on, a lot of thinkers would lean on theology, the idea being that, God, in all his perfection, wouldn't have created a messy, overcomplicated universe.
Like Leibniz and his best of all possible worlds, right?
Exactly.
Everything's perfectly tuned with simplicity as a sign of that divine order.
Precisely. And even Newton, as scientific as he was, saw this kind of, this inherent elegance of nature as reflecting, simplicity, right? But, as science progressed, relying on this kind of divine intervention to explain the universe's simplicity started to feel a bit, well, insufficient.
Yeah. So did philosophers just give up on justifying simplicity, or did they find, like, new ways to make sense of it?
Not at all. Not at all. They went on to explore these metaphysical justifications, arguing that, simplicity is like woven into the fabric of reality itself. So David Lewis, for instance, he uses it as kind of a cornerstone of his possible worlds framework, but this raises even, deeper questions about the nature of reality and what's going on there.
Yeah, it does. It feels like we're, like, tunneling deeper and deeper into the philosophical bedrock here. But what about, like, a more grounded approach? Did anybody try to justify simplicity by looking at what scientists actually do?
Yeah, that's where those what they call naturalistic justifications come in.
Okay.
This approach is trying to, like, root simplicity in scientific practice itself,
Yeah.
arguing that scientists demonstrably favor simpler theories, right? It's like looking for Occam's razor in action, like out there in the wild.
Ah,
Yeah.
so it's about finding, evidence that scientists are naturally gravitating towards simpler explanations, even without explicitly invoking Occam.
Exactly, yeah. And the source actually uses the the debate between what they call extensionist versus dispersal theories in biogeography
Right.
as a potential example of this.
Right.
So, extensionists, they explained like the distribution of species by proposing things like land bridges that have since vanished, so that animals could cross over. But then the dispersalists, they argued that like just regular migration and evolution alone could account for the patterns. We don't need to add in these extra entities.
So a classic case of parsimony winning out.
It does seem that way.
Yeah, like they basically said, we can explain this just as well with a simpler model. Why add the complexity?
Yeah, it does seem that way, but it also highlights the challenge of trying to like isolate parsimony as like the sole deciding factor, right?
Right.
Because even in that case, there were other considerations that play, like whether the dispersal mechanisms they were proposing, could actually account for all the data.
Right. Yeah. It makes you wonder if there's always a bit of, a judgment call involved,
Yeah.
even when we think we're being like purely objective about simplicity. But didn't you mention something about like using probability and statistics to kind of get a handle on this?
Oh, you're right. I did. So some philosophers have turned to those more formal tools to try and kind of quantify the trade-off between simplicity and accuracy,
Okay.
right? Because, you know, a theory can be beautifully simple, but if it just clashes with the data, what good is it, right?
Yeah, it's like that saying, like, all models are wrong, but some are useful. We
Right.
need that balance between elegance and actually being able to explain what we observe.
Exactly. And statisticians actually have a bunch of different, methods for navigating this, right? It's often framed in terms of what they call curve fitting.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine, you have a scatter plot of data points
Right.
and you're trying to find, the best curve to represent that data.
So, like, finding the equation that captures the underlying pattern of those points.
Exactly.
Yeah. But wouldn't, like, the most accurate curve be one that goes through, like, every single point, no matter how complex it gets?
You're catching on quickly.
Yeah.
That's the danger of what they call overfitting, right? Where you might end up with this model that's like super, super complex, perfectly matching like the noise and randomness of your specific data, but it fails to capture like the real underlying trend, right?
Yeah.
It's like memorizing the answers for a test
Right.
instead of understanding the concepts.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You might ace that test, but you won't be able to apply that knowledge to anything else.
Oh, that's such a good analogy. Yeah.
So that's why this parsimony matters, right? In statistical modeling,
Yeah.
it pushes us to find models that strike that balance,
Yeah.
capturing those essential patterns without getting lost in the noise.
Right. Yeah. But the source point out that even statisticians, they disagree on exactly how to strike that balance.
Right.
There are different criteria, like AIC and BIC, each with their own sort of way of weighing simplicity against like goodness of fit.
And that's crucial because it highlights that there might not be like one single best way to balance these goals, right?
Right.
The choice of criteria might depend on what you're ultimately after, probable truth, predictive accuracy, or something else entirely.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes you wonder if even these seemingly objective mathematical methods have some kind of like subjective element lurking beneath the surface.
Mm-hmm.
But let's shift gears for a bit. The source also brings up this idea of quantitative parsimony,
Right.
basically, that we should prefer theories that propose fewer individual entities.
Right, and that raises a whole new set of questions, right?
Yeah.
Like, is assuming one neutrino, better than assuming 207 just because it's a smaller number?
Right.
Or is there a more principled reason?
Yeah, it does seem a bit arbitrary, at first glance.
Yeah.
Shouldn't, like, the number of entities just be determined by what best explains the phenomena?
Hmm.
Regardless of whether it's like one tidy entity or a whole zoo of particles.
Yeah, that's the challenge, and the source actually uses the discovery of the neutrino to show how this quantitative parsimony can actually lead to greater explanatory power.
Okay.
It's not just about liking small numbers.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about these neutrinos.
Okay, so physicists were really puzzled by these like missing spin values they were finding in certain particle decays.
Okay.
And the solution was to propose the existence of the neutrino.
Right.
But why assume just one neutrino per decay, right?
Yeah.
Why not 2 or 10 or 100?
Yeah, good point. Yeah. It seems like those alternatives could work just as well, like mathematically.
The key is that the single neutrino hypothesis, coupled with this assumption that there are no particles with even smaller spin values, offered like a more elegant and comprehensive explanation.
Oh.
Right? It accounted not only for the missing spin that they were seeing, but also for the absence of other fractional spin values in various
Oh,
experiments.
I see. So quantitative parsimony here wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about finding like the explanation that covered the most ground with the fewest assumptions.
Exactly.
Yeah, sort of like elegance and efficiency combined.
Exactly. It's about maximizing the explanatory power while minimizing this unnecessary baggage, right?
Right.
But the source, reminds us that this isn't the whole story. There's another philosophical thread that kind of pulls in the opposite direction principles of plenitude.
Okay, now my brain's doing backflips. We're going from minimalism to maximalism.
Yeah, yeah. Think of it this way. Parsimony tells us to be stingy with our entities, right?
Right.
Plenitude says, if something's possible, it probably exists.
So instead of Occam's razor, we've got like a philosophical fire hose spraying entities everywhere.
Yeah, hold on tight.
Oh man.
It's not quite that chaotic, but it definitely challenges this parsimony first kind of mindset, right?
Right.
The source uses magnetic monopole as an example. So these hypothetical particles, with only one magnetic pole instead of the usual, north-south pair,
Right.
they're perfectly allowed by our current theories,
Okay.
but we've never actually, observed them.
So by Occam's razor, we should just assume they don't exist then, right?
Yeah.
Why add something to our ontology that doesn't seem necessary?
Well, the proponents of plenitude would say that just because we haven't seen them yet doesn't mean they're not out there. I mean, the universe is vast,
Yeah.
and our knowledge is limited.
Yeah, it's like that line from Jurassic Park, like life finds a way.
Exactly.
Maybe magnetic monopoles are just playing a really good game of hide and seek.
It does. It raises this fascinating question about the limits of our knowledge and the role of possibility in shaping our understanding of what exists, right?
Yeah.
If something could be true, is that enough to warrant including it in our model of reality?
Whoa, that's a deep thought. It makes you wonder if our preference for parsimony might be like sometimes blinding us to the full richness and weirdness of the universe.
And speaking of richness and weirdness, the source briefly touches on the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Right.
It suggests that every possible outcome of a quantum event actually does occur, just in different branches of reality. Talk about embracing plenitude.
Okay, now we're really in sci-fi territory. So instead of one universe, there are countless like parallel universes where every possibility is playing out. Does that mean there's a universe out there where I'm like a Grammy Award-winning podcast host and a world-famous astrophysicist?
It's a possibility, however improbable. But let's bring things back down to earth for a moment and talk about the connection between simplicity and that other philosophical heavyweight, induction.
Ah, induction. The process of drawing general conclusions from specific observations. The source did mention a link between Occam's razor and how we make predictions about the future.
Right. So Schulte, who's a philosopher mentioned in the source, argues that simpler theories actually make induction work better.
Okay.
The fewer entities and assumptions we have in our model, the less likely it is that we're going to have to revise those hypotheses when new data comes in.
So it's like building a house on a really strong foundation.
Yeah.
The simpler the design, the less likely it is to collapse when the winds of new evidence start blowing.
It's an interesting argument, but it raises questions about whether we're maybe prioritizing like stability over truth, right?
Yeah.
What if the universe is just inherently messy and complex? Right.
Would clinging to like these overly simplistic models, actually hinder our understanding in the long run?
Yeah, it's a tough call. It's like we're trying to navigate this philosophical tightrope between the simplicity we crave, and the complexity of the world around us.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us to a final thought-provoking question that's raised by the source.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about balancing simplicity and accuracy, but what if there is no single like best way to do that?
Right.
What if simplicity ultimately boils down to like a matter of personal taste?
Oh man. So after all this deep diving into the philosophy of simplicity, we're basically left with with more questions than answers.
It seems that way.
I guess that's the beauty or maybe the frustration of exploring these big ideas, right?
There's always more to uncover, more nuances to kind of ponder.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how much, our assumptions and preferences shape how we see the world, even in something that feels or seems so objective as science, right?
Yeah, it does. It does make you wonder if sometimes, maybe the search for a single, like, right answer might be a little misguided. Maybe navigating these complexities is more about finding the most useful lens,
Hmm.
for understanding a particular problem rather than like a universally applicable principle.
So simplicity isn't necessarily like a sign of truth, but it could be like a really powerful tool for making sense of the world around us.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, choosing the right map for a journey, right? Like a really detailed topographic map might be great for like hiking a mountain trail, but it'd be totally overwhelming if you're just trying to get across town, right?
Yeah. Similarly, different notions of simplicity might be more appropriate depending on the specific, scientific or philosophical question that we're grappling with.
Right. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. But it still leaves me with this kind of nagging question, like if simplicity is so contextual, how do we avoid just kind of picking and choosing, whatever fits our preconceived notions?
Yeah, that's where things get really, really interesting. It pushes us to be, much more self-aware, I think.
Yeah.
To critically examine, our own biases and preferences when we're applying these concepts. And it also, I think, underscores the importance of open dialogue and debate where different perspectives can kind of challenge and refine, our understanding of simplicity and its role in knowledge building.
So it's not just about finding, the simplest explanation. It's about understanding the why behind our preference for simplicity and acknowledging like the limitations of that preference, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's about recognizing that this quest for simplicity is like an ongoing process, It's a constant balancing act between our desire for elegance and like the messy complexity of the world that we're trying to understand.
Well, after this deep dive, I'm definitely seeing simplicity in a
Yeah.
in a whole new light.
Yeah.
It's not just about decluttering your sock drawer anymore.
Right.
It's a fundamental philosophical puzzle with implications for how we understand, everything from the laws of physics to the nature of reality itself.
And I think that's what makes this topic so fascinating, right? It cuts across, so many different domains of knowledge, and it challenges us to really think critically about the tools that we use to make sense of the world.
Absolutely, yeah. And for our listener, if you're feeling inspired to explore these ideas further, we highly recommend checking out the full Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on simplicity.
Yeah, it's a great one.
Yeah, we'll be sure to include a link in the show notes.
Yeah, it's a fantastic resource for delving, deeper into the nuances of these concepts and engaging with the really rich history of philosophical thought on this topic.
And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you in this deep dive? Do you think simplicity is an objective virtue? Is it a subjective preference or something else entirely?
Yeah, share your insights, continue exploring these ideas, and who knows, maybe you'll even stumble upon like a new philosophical razor of your own.
Oh, like that. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and remember, sometimes the most profound truths are hidden beneath a deceptively simple surface.